It's December 23rd, 2023. This is Political Dharma, and I am Alan Zundel. This week, a new poll by Quinnipiac University showed that support for independent candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is holding steady against Democrat Joe Biden, Republican Donald Trump, and other candidates for the U.S. president, although it also shows some movement of voters within various subcategories of the population. Also this week, the Colorado Supreme Court banned Donald Trump from appearing on the ballot in their state, a case that is headed to the U.S. Supreme Court and will likely benefit Kennedy more than Biden. First, let's take a look at that Quinnipiac poll. The Quinnipiac poll is well regarded among polling specialists and has been assessing support for presidential candidates monthly. Here, I'm comparing their poll conducted across November 9th to the 13th with their most recent poll conducted across December 14th through the 18th. When they asked registered voters which of 5 presidential candidates they would vote for if the election were held today, given the margin of error of plus or minus 2.4 percentage points, the level of support for each candidate is virtually unchanged. In the new poll, Biden gets support from about 36% of the voters. Trump ties him at 38%. Kennedy gets 16%. And independent candidate Cornel West and Green Party candidate Jill Stein each get 3%. As I said, this shows virtually no change in support for any of the candidates over the last month. But let's break down voters by subgroups and take a closer look for any changes. When you break the voters down by party affiliation, support for each candidate among Republicans and Democrats is again virtually unchanged from the earlier poll. But Kennedy seems to have lost a bit of support from independents, going from 30% in the November poll down to 25% in the more recent poll. It's hard to tell which candidates those voters have switched to because the numbers are so small, but the biggest uptick was in Trump support among independents, which went from 25% to 28%. My best guess is that Kennedy lost some support for his pro-Israel views as public sympathy turned from the Israelis to the Palestinians with the continuing Israeli attacks on Gaza, and that those voters who left Kennedy went in different directions. Again, we're talking about relatively small changes in the numbers. I couldn't find any substantial difference between November and December when support is broken down by the categories of men and women or whites with and without a college degree, but I did find some differences when broken down by age or race. Among 18 to 34-year-olds, there was a drop in support for Trump of 5 percentage points from 25% in November to 20% in December, and a slight uptick in support for Green Party candidate Jill Stein of 3 percentage points from 7% to 10%. I doubt if these voters were moving directly from Trump to Stein. That would be pretty unusual. But instead, there was a movement of voters away from Trump to other candidates, and then a movement from other candidates to Stein for various reasons, which together left support for Biden, Kennedy, and West unchanged overall among these younger voters. There was also a slight drop in support for Trump among 35 to 49-year-olds from 41% in November to 37% in December, with no noticeable changes for the other candidates. Among 50 to 64-year-olds, there was a 7 percentage point jump in support for Biden from 33% to 40%, which seems to have come a little bit from Trump and a little bit from Kennedy. Although, again, with such small numbers and given the margin of error, it's hard to tell. And among voters 65 and older, there was a 5 percentage point drop in support for Biden from 47% to 42%, and a 7% jump in support for Trump from 38% to 45%. So in summary, there was some movement away from Trump among voters under the age of 65, but a gain in support among voters 65 and older, leaving the total support for each candidate about where it was a month ago. Now let's take a look at race. The levels of support among white voters for each candidate are virtually unchanged from November to December. However, among black voters, there was a significant decline in support for Trump, dropping from 16% in November to just 4% in December, a full 12 percentage points less. Where did those voters go? Mostly to Biden, jumping 11 percentage points from 50% to 61%. Why this change happened, I don't really know. But a few black voters also migrated over to Cornel West, moving his support from 6% to 10% of black voters, and a few to Jill Stein, moving her support from 6% to 9%. The 4% of black voters who said they wouldn't vote and the 3% who were undecided in November completely disappeared in December. Overall, black voters abandoned their flirtation with Donald Trump and seemed to make up their minds who they would vote for. Since black voters are a minority of the total population, these movements didn't affect overall support for the candidates either. But it's noteworthy, given the traditional black support for the Democratic Party, that nearly 40% of them said that they would vote for somebody other than Biden. Let's take a look now at Hispanic voters. Hispanic voters shifted 5 percentage points from Trump to Biden, leaving them at 35% for Biden and 25% for Trump, instead of tied between the two as they were in November. Again, a 5 percentage point shift among one subset of the population did not affect overall levels of support for the different candidates very much. This takes me back to the beginning, in which, despite these movements of various subsets of voters between the candidates, when the voters are taken as a whole, their level of support for each candidate hasn't changed very much from November to December. Now, that's not good news for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because he needs to be increasing his level of support from month to month instead of just holding steady in order to have any chance of winning this election. But there are some considerations that make the picture a little more encouraging for the Kennedy campaign. For one thing, Cornel West is unlikely to appear on the ballot in very many states. That's because he doesn't have the financial resources necessary in order to hire petitioners to get signatures from voters, or to hire the legal help he'll need to get on the ballot access. Now, Kennedy does have those kind of resources to enable him to get on the ballot. Also, Jill Stein, or any Green Party candidate for that matter, usually tends to max out at a few percent in the general election. So assuming that Kennedy can get on most, or maybe even all, the ballots in the states, this looks like it could be more like a 3-person race than a 5-person race. In a 3-way race, Kennedy does much better than in a 5-way race. Well, the support levels for Biden and Trump don't change. Kennedy gets only 16% of the voter support in a 5-way race, but gets 22% in a 3-way race, an increase of 6 percentage points. In effect, the presence of Cornel West and Jill Stein on a ballot is a detriment to Kennedy, but West is unlikely to be on many ballots, and Stein is unlikely to grow her support very much, as I just said. Also, in a 3-way race, Kennedy's support has grown in all age categories other than 65 and older voters. It jumped 8 percentage points among 18 to 34-year-olds, from 32% in November to 40% in December. So the more younger voters are inspired to turn out to vote, the better Kennedy will do. Another plus for Kennedy is that between November and December, his unfavorable ratings declined from 36% to 32%, for a net favorability of -4 percentage points in November and -2 percentage points in December. A small change, but a positive one. That's compared to a net favorability of -13 percentage points for Trump and -20 percentage points for Biden in December. Clearly, RFK is viewed more favorably overall than either Trump or Biden. Also, 37% of voters say they haven't heard enough about Kennedy to decide how they view him yet, compared to only 3% of voters who haven't heard enough about Trump and 3% of voters who haven't heard enough about Biden yet to have an opinion. So Kennedy does have more room to grow his support among those voters who haven't made a decision about him yet than either of the major party candidates do. I should note that these findings on favorability are very different from what we saw in the Harvard-Harris poll I covered on my December 2nd episode, although RFK also came out on top for net favorability in that poll as well. Of course, all these candidate comparisons might end up having to be thrown out the window if Donald Trump ends up being barred from running for election. This week, as I reported, the Colorado Supreme Court held that Donald Trump is disqualified from holding the office of president under the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution because he engaged in an insurrection against the Constitution. It therefore barred his name from appearing on the Republican primary ballot in Colorado. The court stayed its ruling until January 4th to allow time for an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is sure to happen. Let's game out what I see as the options available to the U.S. Supreme Court and how each of those options would likely affect the election, particularly looking at how it would have an effect on Kennedy's chances. Of course, the first option is they could overturn the decision and allow Donald Trump to appear on the ballot in all the states. That would leave us with the status quo, and I seriously doubt that they would choose that option for a few reasons. Let me start by quoting a conservative legal scholar on what he thinks about the merits of the Colorado Supreme Court's decision. J. Michael Luttig is a prominent conservative legal scholar and former judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals. It was he, along with liberal legal scholar Lawrence Tribe, who kicked off the idea that Trump was disqualified from office due to his actions related to the events of January 6, 2020. In a recent interview with political writer Ian Ward, Luttig said, quote, "I am confident that the Supreme Court would affirm Colorado Supreme Court's decision based upon the objective law, which in this instance is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment," end quote. He goes on to say that he regards the Colorado court's decision as, quote, "unassailable in every single respect under the Constitution of the United States," end quote. He says he's studied the issue for 3 years now. He's read the entire court decision of over 120 pages, and he thinks it addresses every question that has been brought up regarding the issue, including issues that were brought up in cases in the courts of other states. Again, that's a well-respected and well-informed conservative legal scholar and former judge speaking. In voting to overturn the decision, the conservative members of the court would have to strain against their own conservative principles of legal interpretation. I'm not saying they would never do that, but they would be very reluctant to. It would also be seen as a very political decision, effectively siding with Trump for political reasons. They are loath to be seen that way, especially the supposedly more moderate members of the court, like Chief Justice John Roberts. So for those reasons, I doubt that the court would take that path. A second option would be to affirm the decision and hold that it applies to all the states, effectively barring Trump from appearing on the ballot anywhere. I think that would advantage Kennedy more than Biden, because removing the threat of Trump from the ballot would take away the reason that many independents and even many Democrats are supporting Biden. Consider the answers to this question in the Quinnipiac poll. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Joe Biden is handling his job as president? Nearly half the voters, 46%, say they strongly disapprove. Another 12% somewhat disapproves, making a majority of voters who disapprove. In fact, in almost every category of voter, a plurality strongly disapproves of the way Biden is handling his job. Republicans, independents, men, women, whites, both with and without a college degree, all age categories, white men and white women, whites in general, and Hispanics. In each of these groups, more voters say strongly disapprove than any other of their choices. The only exceptions are Democrats, of whom about half strongly approve of Biden's handling of his job, and blacks, of whom over a third strongly approve. And then consider their answers to this question: how satisfied are you with the way things are going in the nation? Again, nearly half of all voters say that they're very dissatisfied. And in almost all categories of voters, a plurality say that they are very dissatisfied. Republicans, independents, men, women, whites with and without a 4-year college degree, all age categories, white men and white women and Hispanics. Again, the only exceptions being Democrats and blacks. So if you take away Trump as a worry for voters, why would they stick with Biden, especially if they have another choice, such as one with a Kennedy name who promises to break up business as usual in Washington? Independent voters in particular, of whom 44% strongly disagree with how Biden is doing his job, and 49% are very dissatisfied with the way things are going in this country. I don't think the court is very likely to go in that direction because the conservative judges wouldn't want to enrage conservatives around the nation by barring Trump from the ballot. And they do have another option, which is to say that they'll let each state determine for itself whether or not it's going to allow Trump to appear on the ballot in their state. That would probably result in a hodgepodge of court decisions around the nation, but it would be consistent with the conservative judges' reliance on the principle of federalism, which says that the states have their own areas of sovereignty. It also allows them to avoid looking like they took sides in a political battle one way or the other. That decision would make Trump less likely to win because he wouldn't be able to appear on the ballot in all the states, and could remove the threat of Trump enough to give Kennedy an opening, as I said before. Or Republicans could decide to avoid that kind of mess entirely by abandoning Trump and coalescing around another Republican primary candidate, such as Nikki Haley. That would effectively remove Trump as a threat and open up the way to Kennedy as well. This could result in a Kennedy win in several states, perhaps throwing the outcome of the election to the U.S. Congress, as the Constitution says that it should when the Electoral College is unable to find a majority. And as I showed in my last episode of this show, Robert F. Kennedy thinks that he has a good chance of winning in that scenario of the decision going to the House of Representatives. So that's it for this week. I'll be gone for the holidays for a few weeks, returning again in mid-January. So if you want to make sure you know when I'm back and when my next show is available, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. And while you're at it, you can also like and share this program. I hope we all have a happy new year awaiting us and hope I see you again. Thanks.
With ease, I see the chains are breaking. We gained our focus, the moves we're making will prove to determine our self-worth as a passenger on this vehicle Earth.